So welcome everybody. We today have also not just academic presentations, but also experts, really practitioners actually doing their job in practice, sharing their insights about investor sustainability engagement today with us. And I asked actually everybody of you to introduce yourself and also introduce, of course, the organization you're from, and particularly also the challenge that you're facing at this moment that is most important, and maybe already a short solution. And I think we actually did this in alphabetical order, which means that Rients is the first one presenting Eumedion. So can you please introduce yourself to us?
Thank you very much, Anna, and thanks for the invitation to be here with you today. So I noted during the earlier session that many speakers already know what I will be saying, but let me introduce myself and my organization. I'm Rients Abma. I'm Executive Director of Eumedion, and Eumedion is a collaboration of 53 institutional investors focused on corporate governance and sustainability. Our members are small and large pension funds, asset managers, and insurance companies. We have members such as ABP, PGGM, NNIP, Robeco, but also some very large foreign institutional investors like BlackRock, Capital Group, Schroders, and Aberdeen. So in total, 53. Our mission is to improve corporate governance and sustainability policies at Dutch listed companies. And we are also supporting organization of the Dutch Corporate Governance Code. So we connect our own policies with the overarching focus of the Dutch Corporate Governance Code, and that is long-term value creation of listed companies. And we do that, we try to achieve that by being responsible and engaged institutional investors. So one of the means to achieve our mission is by organizing collective engagements with Dutch listed companies. We have approximately 80 dialogues each year with approximately 40 Dutch listed companies. And as we represent between 25 and 30% of shares in the Dutch market, we have in general very good access to the boards of listed companies. And I have to admit, Christoph, that these private engagements are more effective and are also more efficient than only raising questions at the shareholders meeting. It is a real session with executives where you can have questions and answers without such a large audience as with shareholders meeting. Actually, we conduct 3 forms of engagement. First, we have our annual regular dialogue ahead of the AGMs with at least all AX companies. And during these dialogues, we discuss the focus items that are contained in our annual focus letter that is sent to all Dutch listed companies. This focus letter contains the priorities for the next reporting and proxy season that from an institutional investor's point of view are critical to long-term value creation of Dutch listed companies. For 2022, our focus was on climate action. We requested all Dutch listed companies to come forward with a climate action plan with concrete short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals aligned with the Paris Climate Agreement. We requested more focus on board, but also employee diversity in a broader sense than only gender, and to be transparent on your human rights due diligence policies. But in addition to these focus points, also some entity-specific topics related to corporate governance and sustainability are discussed, as well as key proposals that are submitted for decision making by the AGM. Secondly, we conduct engagements at the invitation of companies. For example, if the company consults with shareholders and stakeholders about a new proposal for executive remuneration, we are taking part in that consultation round. And if the company would like to clarify a strategy change or a big M&A transaction or an amended sustainability policy or another key decision, and they would like to discuss that and explain that to the shareholders, we take part in such kind of discussion. And we also take part in materiality assessments by companies that are quite popular these days. And thirdly, we of course may also initiate engagements by ourselves. So if there are serious corporate governance and sustainability shortcomings, and we would like to see change in the corporate governance and sustainability policy, we also request such an engagement with boards. We may also initiate an engagement if a clarification is needed regarding a specific board decision, a specific policy area, key risks, or an AGM proposal, or if we would like to provide input ahead of the final decision making by the company board regarding a change in its corporate governance structure or sustainability policy. Then your last part of your question, what are the most important challenges regarding engagements? Now, in my view, and for my organization, it is firstly the right level of expertise, seniority, and experience of our own delegation in order to be a good sounding board for the management and the board of directors, and to be able to challenge the board and management regarding strategy, key risks, and various policy areas. And secondly, we still have to align or to better align the messages that portfolio managers on the one hand and ESG experts on the other hand are sending to management. Sometimes these messages are quite mixed. Some of them more or less focused on financial topics, other on ESG topics, and we should try to better integrate that message. And we still have to work on better and balanced reporting on the outcomes of engagements. That is still a challenge. So on the one hand, a fruitful discussion with companies benefits from the possibility to have a quite open discussion behind closed doors with Chatham House rules, as Christoph called it, the invisible meetings. But on the other hand, the clients and beneficiaries of our members, the institutional investors, request more and more for better reporting on the impact of dialogues conducted. So we are still working on striking the right balance between these two interests, and setting clear objectives and targets may help in that respect. So I leave it with this as an opening statement, and I look forward to having a good discussion about these issues.
Thank you for these very informative opening statements. You may pass the mic to Mark and Jesper from Follow This. So welcome, Mark and Jesper. Can you tell us about Follow This and what you're doing?
Yes, I give the introduction to Jesper, who has been here all afternoon.
Yeah, so just to reflect quickly on the contrast that we can observe from the panels that we've seen so far and the panel that we have here, I think it's interesting to note that I think all of us would also like to see changes in the way that companies have to operate and in the way that the system that we currently operate in the way that it works. But in practice, we have to deal with what we have. And that's why we're gonna tell you about the way that we use the way the rules stand currently and creatively use them to affect change within the scope of what we can do. And I'll let Mark handle the introduction of what Follow This actually is.
Yes, thanks a lot, Jesper. Thanks for inviting us. Yeah, Jesper made it quite clear. So we use the current system. So we try to change the system by entering it and use the current tools, because we don't think there's much time left to fight to fight climate change, that we can't wait for new rules. Follow This is a group of green shareholders in big oil. We're very much focused on climate change and big oil because it's our conviction that if big oil doesn't change, there's no chance we're going to meet the Paris Climate Agreement. We need to support big oil to shift their investments from more fossil fuels to renewables. They have the brains, the billions, the global reach to speed up the energy transition. Having said that, after 7 years of campaigning, they don't want to do that. We've just attended 9 shareholder meetings of big oil companies, BP and Shell in London, Exxon and Chevron in the US, and 5 more. They're very determined to continue their current business model, especially with the current oil price. Of course, they all make nice promises for 2050, but our last hope is that the shareholders are really going to force them to change because they won't do it on their own accord. And that's where Follow This is based on. We think we need to unite shareholders in big oil to force them to change, because there's a lot more at stake than the future of big oil, the future of the entire portfolio of an institutional investor and pension funds at stake. And that's why we get more and more support. But basically, we give an extra tool to engagement. Engagement is behind closed doors, it's confidential, but now there are consequences. So after engagement, you can also say to an oil major, we're not going to only tell you behind closed door that you have to change, we're going to vote for a resolution that asks for change. And since 2016, we filed that kind of resolutions. We basically say shareholders support the company, the oil company, to set targets that are aligned with the Paris Climate Agreement, and these targets should cover all emissions, scope 1, 2, and 3. I'm not sure if everybody's familiar with that terms here. Scope 1 and 2 is your own emissions.
I hope so, at least.
Scope 3 is we briefed scope 3. So sometimes I have to explain it, but okay, scope 3 is the emission of your products. That's the first. That was basically the first achievement. The first thing we achieved is that Shell and later BP and Equinor first said your resolution is unreasonable because we are not responsible for scope 3. So we ignited that debate about scope 3, and after a small percentage of shareholders, just 6% at Shell, 8% at BP, voted for our shareholder resolution, they set scope 3 targets. So they really crossed the Rubicon, and now finally we have something to talk about. And I think that was really a crucial addition to engagement. Engagement had been going on climate already from 2000 when the IIGCC was founded. After 15 years in 2015, there was no investments in renewables yet. So that's what we basically achieved together with Dutch investors. I have to say that it's really the personal leadership of a lot of Dutch investors who initially thought, okay, Follow This, that's too radical, that's too activistic. One by one, they started voting for our resolution. And last AGM season at Shell, all 10 biggest Dutch investors voted for the Follow This climate resolution and voted against Shell's own resolution that asked support for the current strategy that increases emissions. So in the Netherlands, we're there, but the big challenge now is to unite shareholders to be far more demanding from big oil, because what happened last year at the Shell AGM, 20% voted for our resolution, which is a lot. All other resolutions, 99% votes with management. 20% voted against Shell's strategy. But the coming year, Shell and every other oil major can claim we have 80% of our shareholders behind our current strategy, which is increasing emissions in the next decade. So the 20%, that's a challenge for this year, have to unite the others and tell them, if you don't vote, these companies will keep on using you as an excuse not to really change, and we won't meet the Paris Climate Agreement.
Thank you so much. You can hand over the mic to Mart, because we are talking about now the VBDO, and we already heard about you when Christophe actually presented the questions paper. So maybe you can introduce further VBDO and what you're doing.
Thanks. Yes, Mart van Kuijk from VBDO. So we were the ones that asked 733 questions in 7 years, I think. I think this year it was 156 or something. But yeah, VBDO, Dutch Association of Investors for Sustainable Development. It's been around for 25 years, 27 since 1995. And we're a member organization. We have a lot of the same members as Eumedion, but also NGO members and private investors And it's approximately 80% of the assets under management in the Netherlands. But the difference is that the things that we do not do it on behalf of our members, but we do it, they support our mission. So everything that we do is independent. I think that's a good thing to know. Yeah, so next to engagement, which we do yearly, we also have our responsible investment benchmark, and we perform research on different responsible investment topics. But for engagement, we perform two types of engagement. One is thematic, which is not every year, but it's on a project base. And it's, for example, a new project that we're starting with an NGO, Client Earth, which is on plastic pollution. And we're first looking at which companies are actually polluting the earth based on plastic. And then we're trying to engage with international investors to see if we can get our investor group to tackle this problem. And the other one is our yearly engagement, which we have been doing for 25 years now. When Piet Splengers started to visit the AGM of Shell, first asking about transparency, and now we're not alone anymore on the AGM. Yeah, so for our yearly engagement, we engage with 40 largest Dutch stock listed companies, and we have a focus letter that we send each year to the companies, to the CEOs of those companies, which this year were biodiversity, labor conditions, supply chain, and diversity. And we engage with the companies first through a benchmark. So for each of the 3 focus teams, we make criteria and we benchmark the companies based on that. So we know how sustainable they are on each topic. Then based on that benchmark, we draft questions and we send it to the company, and we perform pre-AGM calls up front of the AGM. And after that, we officially form the 3 questions to the AGM. So yeah, what's our challenge? I think for VBDO it's difficult because we have a minimum amount of shares. So we do it independently. And for us, it's about asking the question. So in Dutch, you say de kracht van herhaling. It's the power of repeating the question. I think that's something that definitely works. But we're also always looking for new ways to engage with the company, perhaps sometimes on an emotional level, but also on a more research level. So really going into depth. But I think a challenge for us to keep on innovating and trying to engage with the company on a level that really that touches them. And I think this year we will start to change our engagement tactics, and we will engage with our members to see how we can make it more effective in the coming years.
Okay, thank you. Well, great plans ahead. Simon, can I give you the floor for ShareAction?
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for having me. Simon Rawson from ShareAction. We're based in the UK and we operate largely in the UK, but also across Europe, and investors that we work with are based across the world. For me, this has been a crash course in learning about investor engagement in the Netherlands, which is fantastic and really interesting. I'll offer some insights as to how that varies from our perspective. And it's interesting because ShareAction it's a little bit like all of the other organizations that we've heard about, and I'll try and quantify or qualify exactly how it differs. So we see our role both as working with investors to lead engagement, but also holding investors to account. So we try to call ourselves a critical friend to the investment industry, and we fastidiously take no money from them to ensure that we retain our independence. So on the investor accountability side, we look at the world's 75 largest asset managers, 75 largest banks, and increasingly we'll look at private equity as well, and benchmark their performance on responsible investment against not particularly creative criteria, but looking at their policies and practices, reporting transparency, governance arrangements around traditional ESG issues. We obviously use that for public campaigning, but we engage with them privately too, to try to draw out leading practice. We don't call it best practice, but leading practice within the investment industry, and try and share that. Then in terms of collaborating with investors, it's similar to the models that have already been described. So I personally look after all of our collaborative investor initiatives. That means building coalitions of investors. We don't have one supporter base in the same way that VBDO might, but build coalitions of investors around specific topics or issues. And perhaps maybe also to draw out what's interesting for us is we're, obviously have been very heavily involved in climate, nature, but actually focus equally on social issues. So we've been engaging with investors and investors engaging with companies on things like working conditions, living wages, and also public health, population health, and the impact of companies' products, marketing, and labor practices on population health, which we'd be happy to talk about as well. I just give a quick example of why we think that we need to hold the investment system to account. We very much see it as a driver and complementary to the sort of progressive changes to corporate governance that we talked about here today, but very much a driver of that. But investors left to themselves are not going to solve the problems that we face in this world. Take a well-known example. You may be familiar with the Climate Action 100 plus group of a couple of hundred investors with something like, I have the number, $68 trillion of assets under management amongst them, engaging with the world's most systemically important, high-emitting companies, just coming to the end of its first period of operating as an investor-led collaborative engagement initiative. 70% of their target companies have set net zero targets. Great. Fewer than 20% of them have got credible decarbonization plans. And that suggests to me that something about what CA 100 Plus are doing isn't quite working. Now, to their credit, all of those data points that I just quoted are from CA 100 Plus's own benchmark. So they've got a good benchmark. It's progress, I suppose. But now we look at those investors who are members of the Climate Action 100. A third of those investors in their public materials do not identify climate change as an engagement priority. 80% of them don't have climate objectives. So even if they say they're engaging on climate change, they don't have objectives. So the investors themselves are not committed to outcomes that would be in line with net zero. And similarly, 80% talk nothing about how they escalate engagement. So we can go on to talk about what good investor engagement looks like. But for us, I suppose the challenge we would say is generally investor ambition, and transparency and scrutiny and accountability of what investors are doing. Because at the end of the day, who do those investors represent? They largely represent savers, pension savers, and ultimately retail clients, and they're not being held accountable as they need to be.
Well, thank you for these interesting opening statements, actually. We will move to Sander from MN Services. Sander is online joining us today. Welcome, Sander. Can you introduce yourself and MN?
Yes, hi all. Thank you for the invite to be here. I am unlucky to be inside and not with you all, despite being about, I think, 1.5 kilometers away. So it's a bit unlucky. But yes, so I'm Sander Urbach. I work for MN Services. We're a fiduciary manager for a couple of the biggest pension funds in the Netherlands, which means that we both manage their assets, do administration work, and also advise them on anything from risk to responsible investment and sustainability. That is what I do. So I lead our climate engagement program. Yeah, at MN, we consider ourselves a responsible investor. We manage about 180 billion for our clients. And through many instruments, we try to do that as sustainable as possible. More specifically on engagement, we run a couple of engagement programs for most of them for our biggest client, PMT, some also for PME, And these cover climate, as I said. I will go into that more later. Biodiversity, also human rights, living wages. We're very active in the platform Living Wage Financials, for example. We do remuneration. We do good labor transition in labor, labor rights. So yeah, we try to cover E, S, and G throughout our engagement programs. So I am leading our climate engagement program, or coordinating, as I should say, which is a huge program. We started in the end of 2021. This was the first full AGM season that we did for this program. We conducted this program specifically for our largest client, PMT. Our other client, PME, as you might have heard, has divested from oil and gas companies recently. And we do engage some heavy emitters on their account. But specifically for PMT, we engage all oil and gas companies in their portfolio. So this includes a big chunk of the oil majors that follow this also has their resolution on the agenda. But also very small upstream companies or oil services, midstream companies. We have very specific milestones, of which Simon, I think, would approve. So this year, we expected them to at least have a net zero ambition for 2050 for all scopes of emissions. And for next year, so this is 2023, we expect them to also have targets aligned with the 1.5 degree pathway to net zero. Specifically for oil producers, we also expect them to stop greenfield exploration and give this commitment. So these are very specific milestones, but I have to say this is a divestment-led engagement program. So that is very clear in our approach to escalation as well. And yeah, we really try to be as ambitious as possible. I think we're now chairing or leading 5 or 6 Climate Action 100 plus engagements. Also Shell, also Total Energies, for example. We try to really be as ambitious as possible in our voting behavior, and you will see more of that next year. And if the companies don't align with our targets. Yeah, biggest challenge, I think, very clear. All these companies, so none of the oil and gas companies in our portfolio do align with a 1.5 degree pathway to Paris. So that's the biggest challenge, I guess.
Okay, well, thank you, Sander, and thank you all for your opening statements. I think it's very interesting, and I think actually Simon already raised one of like a big discussion point, like Climate Action 100 plus, and you mentioned it, Sander, in your brief presentation just now, and also Rients, maybe you have also a connection with Eumedion and Climate Action 100 plus. So I was wondering, before we move on to the actual questions, do you have anything to say about that related to how you see Climate Action 100 plus, and maybe also your members of Eumedion are also related to Climate Action 100 plus. Would you like to take the floor on that, please?
I can say something about that, although we are not involved in Climate Action 100 plus, although our members are. So, and we also have discussions with the big oil companies regarding their climate transition action plans. Yeah, it is of course a very balancing act, especially nowadays, between, on the one hand, you would love that all big oil companies have their strategy aligned with the 1.5 degrees pathway of the Paris Climate Agreement. On the other hand, you also have to take into account what the social consequences are of, especially in in these days regarding the energy supplies. So that there is a world before the 24th of February 2022 and a world after the 24th of February 2022. So asking the big oil companies not to do research into new oil and gas fields without having the supply from Russia nowadays, that can lead to a new balance for the existing big oil companies. So that will also be taken into account by many of our members, that new fact can lead to a new balance between the social factors and the E factors, so to speak. So that is one of the reasons I think that also the number of votes cast in favor of the follow this resolution was lower than last year. So institutional investors not only have to take into account the environmental consequences of the strategies of the big oil companies, but also the social consequences. And we all know that populistic parties are on the rise, that many households are struggling with paying their energy bills at this moment in time. So there is also a responsibility for institutional investors to take that consequence into account.
Okay, thank you.
So it's not that straightforward, that we only should push the big oil companies to be 100% aligned with the 1.5 degrees pathway without having an eye on the social consequences of that policy.
I think you can pass the mic to Mart. Yes.
Yeah, big oil did an excellent job in convincing investors and society also that the current climate crisis caused by the Ukraine war overrides the current energy crisis caused by the Ukraine war overrides the climate crisis. And that's not true. The answer to both crises is exactly the same. Invest all this windfall profits in renewables, because new exploration will take at least 10 years to come online. So that will not solve the current crisis. So they all want to do new exploration. They get new permits. They go to the North Sea. This will take, Shell said, the newest field will take 3 years. It will take longer, most probably. Even if it would take 3 years, it will not be in time to solve the current crisis. The answer is the same. And the problem is that that big oil has convinced investors that, there are bigger problems now than the climate crisis. The hardships of the current energy crisis will be dwarfed by the climate crisis in 10 years from now. So that's a thing everybody should realize, I think. And what helped, of course, a lot is that the windfall profits. Of course, these profits will be returned to shareholders by dividend and share buybacks. And the best example of that is BlackRock. Last year, BlackRock, biggest investor in the world, voted for climate resolutions. Voted for scope 3 targets, decreasing emissions. This year, Larry Fink says, no, I'm not the environmental police. I'm not going to ask oil companies anymore to cut emissions, which is devastating for the climate. And so, yeah, he's a steward of the world economy. So he also should be the environmental police and cut emissions. And then about one remark about the CA100 Plus for the academics, have a good look at their influence. MN and PGGM are the lead investors in the Climate Action 100 Plus. I'll just give you one example. So they are the most influential alliance of investors. MN and PGGM voted for the follow this resolution. They are the lead investors for the CA100 Plus, voted for the follow this resolution and against Shell's plans. Only 20% followed them. The CA100 Plus benchmark shows very clearly that no oil major is Paris aligned, and still 80% doesn't follow their own benchmark. So I think that's one of the challenges for this year, to unite the investors in the CA100 Plus just to follow their own mission, which is a 1.5 degrees pathway.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for these. Yes, maybe quickly, and then we move on to
Well,
the
I'm
audience.
just going to make a brief general point, which sort
Mhm.
of is that partly driven by the energy crisis, partly just the economic situation coming post-COVID. We are definitely in a different world for whatever you want to call it, responsible investment, ESG investing. Just anecdotally, in the conversations that we're having with investors in trying to get them to support shareholder proposals, heavens, to ask questions at AGMs. I mean, I'm well impressed that you have Dutch investors asking questions, because I can tell you that does not happen in the UK. The sort of language which we're getting back is that language around, oh, maybe it shouldn't be 1.5 degrees, maybe 2 degrees is okay. Very short-term thinking, and is in our view can be addressed, at least in part, by having huge transparency, huge accountability of those investors. And just, you know, as one simple step, I'd love if all the CA 100+ members would disclose publicly which organizations they're the lead investor for engaging with. That'd be a start.
Well, thank you. Are there any questions from the audience? Yes. Yeah, can you, who has the mic? Ah, you have the mic, great. Yeah, let's first do a round of questions from the audience, 2 questions from the audience, and then we move to the chat. Yeah, there, I think, and at the back.
From there, right?
Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentations and talking about your challenges. I think something that I would like some more views on in terms of challenges, perhaps the coordination between the different approaches that a sustainable or responsible investor might take, not to bring to turn this into a debate on divestment versus engagement, but right, there is divestment, there is engagement, there is different ways of engagement. There's the issue with the coordination with, right, on the one hand you engage, and then what does your voting record show? How can we overcome those integration challenges?
Maybe, yeah, maybe first this question, who would like to respond first? And Sander, please raise your hand in Zoom if you also want to, so that we don't forget about you. Great.
Yeah, the answer is transparency. Tell us what you tell in the engagement, and tell us how you vote. And tell us that you are prepared to vote against boards if they are not listening to you. And that's lacking, I think. It's still behind closed doors engagement, and nobody knows what's been discussed and what are the results.
Sander, do you agree with Mark?
Yeah, I think there's value for behind closed doors engagement, though. At least so everyone can freely just argue about strategy and get the ins and outs. I mean, that's very, very valuable for us, at least. But what we can influence really is that the first is, of course, our voting behavior, is our own policies, our own clear timelines for divestment and things like that. I think that's the starting point. What every investor should have is just clear policy on your engagement objectives, clear policy on how you will vote given certain criteria. And included in that is, of course, very much voting on resolutions, but also very much voting against board members, voting against other items on the agenda as well. We have made this very clear throughout our policies. How this year we voted against many board members that just don't have any ambition on climate change. So so being very clear on that is very important, and also being just very open to the companies that you engage with, how you will vote, how you can vote, how your policies are established, and then still there's room for behind closed doors engagement. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Rients and then Mart.
Yeah. No, I think almost all institutional investors are now disclosing their voting behavior. Some even ahead of the shareholders meeting, like Noortjes Bank and Kelpers and Kelsters, and also some European institutional investors already disclosed their voting behavior 5 days ahead, or at least 5 days ahead of an AGM. And almost all institutional investors, at least the Eumedion members, are disclosing their voting behavior after the AGM. So that is already the fact, Mark. As I mentioned, as one of our challenges is with respect to disclosing the impact of engagements. I think that starts with setting priorities and setting clear objectives and targets. And indeed, what escalation measures you would like to take and at what moment in time. I think all institutional investors have a job to do there, and to be more transparent, not only for your own clients and beneficiaries of pension funds, but also you have a wider responsibility to society at large, and also NGOs and media. So I think there's a long way to go. Maybe one specific item you mentioned, divestment versus engagement. That is a big issue nowadays here, in particular in the Netherlands. I think also at the choice between divestment and engagement, transparency is key, and explain your choice to terminate all your investments in, for example, oil companies. Be transparent about it. What motivates that, and what is the conviction or principle or values behind that, and how is it linked to the preferences of your own beneficiaries or clients? And do that the same with continuing in fossil fuel companies, and then be more transparent on the specific objectives and targets with respect to engagement with big oil companies.
Thanks. Yeah. So I do think it's divest or engage, and public scrutiny is also very important with transparency. A couple of years ago, we had dialogues about the voting behavior. That's now already in the process. I think the next one will be about the escalation strategy. Also giving it upfront of the AGM season. Xander was talking about how MN is doing it. I think this should be very clear for all the companies. And I think something that we haven't been talking about, but what was described by ShareAction, is also how investors together can be more active in showing what their objectives are. For example, in Climate Action 100+. Because also from research, you see that if a company divests, which might be very good for the participants and from principal values, that the company is not changing its behavior. So perhaps we should move to more group-wide investors that give their objectives. But I'm also curious to hear what Xander as MN thinks about this, to get more group-wide objectives or escalation strategies.
Xander, if you want, you can briefly react, and then we go to the question in the audience.
Group, yeah, I mean, you mean as several investors within a group. Yeah, I know that's when I read the ShareAction report, that was one of the suggestions, and of course, the problem is we're really bound by compliance laws in coordinating these things. So we cannot share how we will vote or coordinate our vote. We can share how we will vote as an individual investor, but we cannot coordinate how we will vote. We also cannot coordinate with another investor how we will, if we will divest, and when. And so this makes coordination within Climate Action 100+ difficult. But of course, we're now going to the review period for Climate Action 100+. We're coming at the end of the first cycle. So yeah, I'm very, very looking forward to that evaluation, and I think we should align more. We should align our objectives more as investors, and that should be clear. If you're a member of Climate Action 100+, then your objectives should align, I think.
Okay, well,
and our objectives align. So that's the thing.
Okay. Can we move the mic to the, and then we take the question from the chat. Yeah.
Thank you. This is a very interesting conversation. I will ask something which is probably outside of your expertise area, because you are talking about what is within the corporations, and I work more what is outside of the corporations. And I can't resist to ask you this question, because including the Netherlands, in competition law or antitrust law, sustainability is a big topic. And I'm wondering, I find it maybe a bit of a naive question, but what is going on and all this upheaval about giving exceptions under whatever conditions for companies who conclude agreements with sustainability goals, does that have any effect on what you are discussing, making corporations go that way? Because that has been, if I understood it correctly, in the past, one argument they have been raising, look, we can't do that because there are the competition rules. So we would enter into that. And the second question,
let's keep it at one question for now, because we have other questions.
It's just
in the
one
audience.
sentence.
Okay,
whether
one
we
sentence.
should not connect these two areas,
okay,
academically and maybe.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No worries. Any response to that? So it's outside your comfort zone, perhaps, but maybe you have any ideas?
What do you say, competition law is withholding companies?
The ICM in the Netherlands.
For investor behavior or investor behavior or for
corporation.
What's holding? Can I make a follow-up question? How is competition law, say, to make it very practical?
You need a mic.
No, it's very interesting for us to understand, is competition law holding companies to, for example, set Paris consistent targets? Do Paris consistent?
No, it's not regulation. It's not ex ante. It's an ex post control system where they can say, well, you formed a cartel, but they can argue back, yes, but wait a minute, we formed this agreement and colluded. We fixed prices. Why did we fix prices? Because we wanted to put out a more environmentally friendly product. So it's a control mechanism. It does not ex ante, but that's one of the questions, I think, below this whole discussion about sustainability with competition authorities. But we can
I can maybe give a very brief. I can maybe give a very brief example, not related to climate actually, but related to health. And one of the topics we've been working with investors to engage companies on is the role of supermarkets and food manufacturers on creating the obesity crisis. And there is a lot of talk about what restrictions should be placed on supermarkets, their ability to place, promote products based on the healthiness of the product. And conversations that I've been in with investors, but with supermarkets, the representative supermarkets present, is that they talk about, this is the non-lawyer in the room speaking, they talk about creating a pre-competitive space where they can exchange experiences of trials that they might do about how, the impact on sales of different product placement in the store, which then has an implication down the line on how much the proportion of your sales which are healthier foods. So I've certainly heard it talked about, that doesn't relate to your climate question, but are companies comfortable in a pre-competitive space talking about experimenting together to address, in the broadest sense, sustainability challenges. But the really interesting issue, well, that's an interesting issue on which I'm mostly ignorant, but the interesting issue was the one that Xander started to raise, which is around investors claiming that they cannot act because of compliance or competition or collusion fears. I mean, I'd love the lawyers in the room to tell me that that's nonsense, because we do it. We have investors working together, and there's a really interesting difference between those that get comfortable doing it and those that don't get comfortable doing it. But I can tell you, investors do get comfortable working together on sustainability challenges, and somehow some lawyers seem to get comfortable with it and others don't. So that's a really interesting topic on which I'd welcome advice from this room.
Yeah. Rients, do you have to add anything on acting in concert?
The legislation is very different within the European Union. So, for example, in Germany, it is quite a strict regulation with respect to acting in concert. So, if you are colluding with respect to any subject, you are obliged to make a joint notification to the supervisor. In the Netherlands, it's more relaxed. Also in the UK, there is more guidance from the FRC or the regulator with respect to what is acting in concert, but it is really different within the European Union how the supervisors are interpreting that concept of acting in concert, and whether it's only focused on strategic issues or board issues, or also on wider sustainability policies. So that
I would like now to move away from competition law, and I would like to go to
this is not competition law.
Well,
this is company our securities law with respect to acting in concert.
You have questions from the chat, right?
So Philip has made a comment regarding the discussion, and he has said the competition or antitrust question equals the capital markets topic, whether effective stewardship would or should require a wireless exemption from acting in concert as safe harbor, or whether this would only be welcome excuse for collaboration. This is only a comment. And the question that I'm not is raised by Roland, and I'm not sure to whom he's addressing the question, which is that whether the old business model, you mentioned that the old business model is adhered to, but what about other business models, such as the chemical industry's responsible care model?
I think this was, if I recall the perfect timing, I think was related to Mart.
Yeah.
Okay. So, what about?
What about other business models, such as the chemical industry's responsible care model?
I don't know the responsible care model by heart. But you mean that I have to transition
let's otherwise move to another question. Let's do that.
Yeah.
I saw that there was
there is another question in the chat.
Is it a bit broader than the specific business model? Yeah.
Yeah, it's something else.
Okay, let's do it.
The question is that is it better to have so many organizations pushing for this change, or it would be better to have less bigger ones involved? So in other words, do companies profit from more diversity, or do companies profit from more diversity? And the follow-up question is that do you coordinate activities or not?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So I think with Big Oil, we're dealing with a business with an industry that doesn't want to change. They're trying to delay change for decades already. So the more organizations trying to push for that, the better, I think. Sometimes there are unintended consequences of certain organizations. So say the CA 100 Plus has the same goal as follow this, but we always warn them for unintended consequence. And the unintended consequence is that these companies say, yeah, we have the support of the biggest investor alliance in the world to continue with our business. So that's the only disadvantage of having so many organizations. Having said that, this is what industries that don't want to change would love to see, that the people who want them to change are going to fight among each other what's the best tactics. So let's not do that too often.
Thank you.
Okay, let's move on to the question in the room.
Thanks. Simon, you mentioned that a lot of investors are saying, oh, well, 2 degrees would be okay. Why do we bother about 1.5? And I mean, the reality is that that's kind of where most governments are as well. I mean, they've decided that they can't get a specific mandate from their electorates at the moment to push really hard for 1.5. So if investors were going to do that, they'd be front running governments and the political process quite a lot. Do you think they have the clarity of mandate from their clients to take that stronger position?
I'd argue that they have a duty to do it. I mean, aren't all of the pension schemes there to invest for the long term and invest for, not just financial returns in the long term, but also a world that's hospitable in which to enjoy that pension? So I'd argue it's absolutely part of a long-term investor's fiduciary duty to follow the science and to push companies to 1.5 degrees. I guess my reflection on whether whether regulation needs to lead or whether investors are can and should legitimately be pushing things is that it's very much easier for governments to regulate when there is already momentum within the market, and we've seen that with just, for example, reporting. So climate reporting, TCFD reporting, suddenly becoming mandatory in governments, in jurisdictions around the world, but only after most participants have already adopted it voluntarily. So I guess I'm of the view that business and the financial system is so powerful that it's unreasonable to ask governments to do it alone. Sure, they should be working together and pushing together would be my view.
I think that there is a task for investors to challenge boards on climate-related risks. So if you're not a believer in a 1.5 degrees pathway to Paris, it is your duty as an institutional investor to ask companies how they mitigate possible key climate risks. And I think it is also important as an institution, as a long-term institutional investor, to know the various scenarios. So if governments are acting in a way that they promise to do, what the consequences would be for the business model, the long-term business model and long-term value creation of a company. And we as institutional investors would like to know that and challenge management on that. And third point is that CSRD and CSDDD had a new European legislation already incorporates an obligation for all listed companies and also all large non-listed companies to have a climate action plan that is aligned with the 1.5 degrees pathway of the Paris Climate Agreement. So there is already legislation coming from the European government to explain to stakeholders, including shareholders, what your company strategy is to be aligned with the Paris Climate Agreement.
Okay, well, thank you. Actually, the time is already up. It went so fast. So I would like to thank you as a panelist and thank you for all your questions. And let's keep this discussion ongoing during the dinner later this evening, because I think you still have a lot of questions. So thank you all for joining and thank you for your